Wonderful.
I suppose that my view would, I'm a little bit surprised that nobody seems to bring up Poland under Jaruzelski and roughly 40 years ago, almost exactly 40 years ago, in fact, that and the Czech Republic, because while I entirely agree with Russian grievances, etc., I also feel that the right to a buffer zone is um, doesn't belong to a country that is not making itself attractive politically to the outside world. And this is where the Ukraine is much closer to the Czech Republic and Poland in its current identity. I mean, obviously, the Ukraine is made up of lots of subcomponents that are oddly shaped and antagonistic and have their own peculiarities, but collectively, they do have the same set of aspirations as Poland and the Czech Republic have had over a protracted period of time. And I don't feel that it is right to expect them to make themselves subservient to an operating system such as Putin runs in Russia if they don't want to. And clearly, they don't want to be a part of that. And there's just very, probably an irrelevant and slightly too peculiar a point to make, but I remember vividly talking to somebody who was an American lawyer working for Deripaska. And we were saying, well, it's interesting. Is Russia evolving? Is Putin trying to do anything to have the system evolve, the legal system evolve from being presidential to precedential? And the answer was no. That was the disappointing thing. Obviously, how law is practiced in the United States is very uneven too. The Southern District of New York has a good reputation. There are plenty other parts of the country which have much less reputation, and these things can be politically charged. But how well and even-handedly law is practiced is very different even within our own country. But could one say of Russia that the system was evolving in a way that was going to provide a rule of law? And the answer was no. This really is not happening. And I bring this up, peculiar though the point might seem, because as an example of how Russian political culture has not been evolving in a way that countries that aspire to something different could want to accept. And that's why I feel that the evolution in the Czech Republic and in Poland, regardless of the fact that certainly Poland is much more going through its own difficulties, nonetheless, they want to be a part of Europe, and whatever that means to them, and they do not really want to be a part of Russia. And at that point, as a country of 44 million, their own aspirations for self-definition need to be recognized and taken into account, regardless of how legitimate Russia's complaints about being ignored and having their wishes and their security concerns be run roughshod over. Sorry, that wasn't a very good sentence, but if you want to see what I'm saying. Thank you.
Adam, could I just ask before I go on to Ron Maxwell, can you compare that attitude that you've ascribed in Poland or Czech Republic or Ukraine not wanting to be absorbed by a country that is completely lawless, it's just whatever Putin wishes, to the attitude of Taiwan towards being absorbed into mainland China, which also has lawlessness and everything is dictated by President Xi? Are those situations comparable or not, you think?
I'm not in a position to judge. I know so little about Taiwan, aside from reading The Economist type thing. So I'm really not in a position to judge, but I would have guessed from what little I do know that, yeah, what's happened in Hong Kong is deeply, deeply worrying to Taiwan and not the least bit surprising to them. So yes, they're in a similar situation. Have this larger entity has a political and legal culture that we do not want for ourselves.
Yeah, I'll take the liberty now, since I'm in the chair as a ersatz for John Henry. I wanted to raise with John Mearsheimer. You made some comparisons to Russia's reaction, Ukraine, and the U.S. and Cuba, Fidel Castro, and how we viewed Cuba and Castro as a threat to our security interest and existential threat. And the response, we had the Bay of Pigs, the attempted assassinations of Castro, that about Operation Mongoose. We even had plans after the failed Bay of Pigs to invade. Do you think those responses of the United States were morally or legally legitimate responses that we made? That were an example that other countries should and can follow, or are they something that ought not to be followed?
This is a great question, and of course it follows on one of your three initial points, as well as Adam Dixon's comments, which have to do with the subject of rights and what's morally or legally permissible in the international system. I think that in international politics, states usually pay attention to international law and they pay attention to moral precepts as long as they're in their strategic interests. But if there's a conflict between international law and a country's strategic interests, the country will always privilege its strategic interests, and international law and human rights will be pushed off the table. This is why I think it's not very helpful to talk about rights. When you talk about whether Russia has the right to have a buffer state, or Ukraine has the right to have its own foreign policy, these are concepts that, in my opinion, get you into all sorts of trouble. In the international system, might makes right. And the United States would never tolerate a situation where Canada or Mexico invited, in a legal way, China to bring military forces into Toronto or Mexico City. We have a Monroe Doctrine, which is in our strategic interest. And our Monroe Doctrine says no distant great power is allowed to put military forces in the Western Hemisphere. Period. End of story. What the Russians are doing here is they're basically articulating their own version of the Monroe Doctrine. They're saying you cannot turn Ukraine into a Western bastion on our border. It has nothing to do with rights, right? It doesn't matter whether Ukraine has the right to do this or that. We're saying they can't do it. Just like we're saying Cuba can't invite the Soviets to bring military forces into the Western Hemisphere. So for me, when you talk about great power politics, rights in the final analysis just don't matter. Might makes right. And the United States is a mighty powerful country. It's a mighty powerful country on purpose. And it does whatever it thinks is in its strategic interest. And if the rights say that's okay to do, good. But if the rights are at odds with what's in our strategic interest, we do what's in our strategic interest.